Okay, as promised, I am going to do a analysis of Jeffrey Epstein's death chart, if he is in fact dead. So, in the prior video, I had a look at his birth chart and what it's looking like for the evening of Friday, the 9th of August 2019, when he allegedly killed himself or was offed. Things are looking very much like a death chart for him. This is looking like this was, in fact, his demise, and I'm going to give you a number of reasons why. So, at the time, and I'm using a time of death of about 11 p.m. on Friday, August 9th. Anybody who's familiar with the story, there was some sort of intruder upon the area in which Epstein was housed in the correctional facility, and there was some sort of movement in the camera, and that was around, I think it was about 10:39 p.m. So this gives them enough time to have gone in and perhaps sealed his fate. But we don't know that for sure. But using this chart, what we have is Taurus rising, early degrees of Taurus with an ascendant in the third degree of Taurus. And in my reading of a chart in which there's a chance of foul play, even if it was the individual themselves who did it, we treat the first house as the perpetrator of the act. Now, at the time of his death, Uranus was in the seventh degree of Taurus, about 5 degrees away from the ascendant, about to rise. Now, Epstein himself has Uranus in his seventh house, and if in astrology we look at the eighth house usually as being a significator of death, and there's reasons why that is the case, which I'll go over. However, when we look at actual historical precedent for execution, sunset was when the prisoners would be hanged or shot. So if we want to use that as a potential metaphor here, this would be basically a Uranus being, from his seventh house, rising at the time of his demise would make a great deal of sense. So essentially, the planet that's in his seventh house is showing up as rising. Uranus as an indicator of a setting sun, and Uranus on the horizon as a sign that is in fact that the significator of death is rising. So at the time of his death, perhaps the most damning astrological occurrence is that we have the midheaven of the of the death chart is in the 18th degree of Capricorn, which is pretty close to his ascendant in his natal chart, and we have clustered closely around the midheaven in Capricorn in this death chart. We have Pluto almost exactly on his Mercury, his natal Mercury, and we have Saturn almost directly on his ascendant and also very closely conjoining his natal Chiron. If you hadn't looked, or excuse me, listened to my previous video about his natal chart, Chiron is a pretty important player in this chart. So we have basically what I'm trying to say is that the the lords of the underworld, Pluto and Saturn, are rising. They're rather conjoining his ascendant, which would be a pretty good indicator. And they're doing it on the midheaven. This is a very visible death. Um, and Pluto is very tightly conjoining, as I said, his Mercury. So it's telling stories about the underworld. And yeah, that is, I would call that probably the most damning evidence that this was, in fact, the end of Jeffrey Epstein astrologically. Now, what we see is several other things going on in this chart, which are interesting. One is that the moon is in the 8th house of this chart, fairly tightly conjoining Jupiter in the sign of Sagittarius. The moon being in the 17th degree of Sagittarius and Jupiter being in the 15th degree. Now, a moon in the 8th house is a pretty strong indicator of death as well. The 8th house has to do with one's closest compatriots and intimate people in one's life with their stuff, with their network, with the people that they are involved with. And this kind of translates to things that are in our sphere that we really can't control, like our partner's greater family and this sort of idea that this is something coming from our closest business associates or compatriots from their network. The moon doesn't like the 8th because it's at other people's mercy, essentially. So that being said, the thing that's interesting is that the moon being so tightly conjoined with Jupiter in the sign of Sagittarius tends to indicate a protection that this moon, which is indicating his body here, his also his psychic state, is protected by Jupiter. And we find in this chart there is a square relationship between Neptune in the 19th degree of Pisces and this 8th house conjunction between the moon and Jupiter. The 11th house is the house of friends and people of like mind, people who will be supportive of the things that we do. So this could indicate somebody from his network helping him, that there's some sort of influence from Neptune here. Neptune is not a reliable planet. Neptune is delusional and represents images that we present to other people. It's got a great deal of atavism and primordial imagery around it. And it tends to follow people who are celebrities, people who are projecting images of themselves to people in order to influence them. This would include spies and other people who are professionally inclined to deceive. So we know that Epstein had a very powerful network of people just like that in his life. He was closely associated with intelligence networks and espionage and people working um, in very subversive ways societally. So at the time of his death, we have a bunch of other stuff going on too. So this Neptune is also tightly conjoining his natal Mars and Venus, very closely conjoining those two things. This Mars and Venus together indicate one's libido very strongly, both receptive and projecting libido. And the Neptune on top of that tends to cloud things over, moving things towards martial frenzy and something of a stupor, like opiates, is what you get from a Neptune and Venus conjunction. And and I use this idea because I believe this comes from mystery cults, which used these sorts of drugs, and they tried to bring about these like frenzy and also torpor and stupor as they initiated people into the rites of the mystery cults. So that is a very, this is indicative in my mind of these forces being also being transgressed. That his libidinous nature was sort of undercut by this Venusian, um, rather Neptunian force. So what we also find in his death chart is that the transiting Chiron was right on this his natal moon. So again, we're back in this place where Chiron is very strongly indicated. Um, it's in his natal fourth house. Um, so this sort of visits Chiron upon him. As I mentioned before, the modern ideas of Chiron are the wounded healer, but it also has a pretty strong. Um, the archetype was very strongly associated with um, uh, basically sexual activity with minors and very things that are rather that are associated with Epstein himself. Um, so the ascendant in this death chart is and the Uranus were also conjoining his natal Jupiter, which is also kind of a potentially a possibly a contrary indicator, but when we go back to the most basic mythology, that these are two sky gods, Jupiter and Uranus, and there's a dynastic aspect to Uranus especially, and to any sky god, that these are the gods that rise and fall, that they have an aeon of power, and then they are basically castrated, and that's what happened to Uranus. He was in fact castrated, and that detached him from the realm of influence, essentially, where he became a purely spiritual, detached force force and not a one that was so much a interactive with um, the embodied realm. So in that sense, this sort of is a release um, from the earthly influences and a heavenly release, essentially, from this the state in which we're conjoined with the goddess on this plane of existence. So now, yeah, if we're gonna speculate, the strongest evidence clearly for me is we have this the gods of death and decrease, crowded around his natal ascendant in the transiting midheaven of the chart, and we have his moon in the eighth. The moon in the eighth could possibly be significators of him being taken away, essentially, with that Neptune, of him being, in fact, spirited away from this, because this moon is so protected in this chart. So that's, yeah, so it does look like a death chart. It does have the possibility that it was something, something brought him away and was, in fact, removing him from this scene, and that influence was coming from his 11th house, the house of spies. Excuse me, of his friends who are spies and intelligence agents and people who are transgressive. All right, that's it for now.